Hey, welcome back to Prototype. I think we're on the 5th episode already, which is kind of crazy. We just keep pumping these out. I think it's probably like twice a week or something. Maybe on average, like once every few days or whatever, like once every 5 days, maybe. I don't know. You guys can do the math yourself if you're interested, but I know what you guys are really interested in, and that's sending me money. Just kidding. But if you aren't just kidding, you can check the link in the description below to the coffee page. It also sends Veek money. And Veek is a pretty cool guy, so why wouldn't you want to give him some threes? Now, speaking of threes, I got a couple of things, three things, in fact, that I want to talk about in this episode of Prototype. The first of which is 100% related to like single player or co-op versus AI content. The second is about the Acropolis game mode, which OGs may remember, or that might like jig some noggins, get some noggins jogging for jarring people's memory or whatever. So there's another little teaser for you. And then the third thing is about the like simplicity of certain projects and how like sometimes when you do something really quickly or you don't worry too much about like making sure everything is up to snuff standard wise, which sounds a little silly and maybe even dangerous to say. And I'll elaborate on all this stuff, of course. That's just an interesting thing that occurred to me. And it all was down to just happen to watch a YouTube video that seemed to spark that idea in me, or some idea related to it anyway. And so we'll explore all of that and more. But I suppose we can go in maybe reverse order, actually. Well, let me jig this up instead. We'll do 3-1, and then we'll do 1-2, and then we'll do 2-3. And if you can follow along with all of that, then you're a real superhuman, because I can barely do that, and I said it. So the first thing I will talk about is exactly what I was just ending off on, which is the idea of if your project is, good enough, I guess, or whatever, then maybe that's better to get it to that state, and then you can, iterate on it. But if it's like totally playable, say it's a map, or say it's a game even, if it's like playable from start to finish, and you just need to iterate on it, then that's a lot better, right? Like we think about CMBW in its current state, it's playable, right? You can play it, and for the most part, there's obviously some unfortunate multiplayer instabilities, and occasionally you'll get a crash or something. Maybe more occasionally recently because we've been messing around with the graphics, but that's kind of what the pre-release repo is for anyway. And like we're still adding features and stuff, but like that's kind of the quintessential example of what I have in mind when I think about a project that is, you can experience the core of what it is. And then, yes, there are some rough edges that we would like to sand off. We think about the graphics, which I talked about in the last episode of Prototype, and we think about all this other stuff that's like, yeah, we would like to make sure that it's super stable. Yeah, we would like to solve some of the long-standing bugs and issues. And yeah, we would like to complete some of the bigger reworks like the ion cannon and continue shaving off the rough edges of the corpse revival system with reclamation and stuff. And so all of this and more is on my mind when I think about, how can I make a project that is, you can experience the core aspect of it, and then, how can I then improve upon it afterwards? I feel like that's a better sort of garden, if you want to use that analogy. Like you're going to grow better food that way if you do it in this manner, if you break it down like that. And of course, you can break that down even into smaller tasks. You can think about making just a single map, even if it's a melee map. Like, okay, well, you make it playable and then worry about like fine tuning all of the pathways, or making sure that the cover is writ in the right spot and updating all the resources to be, exactly what they should be for the scarcity or the yield or the defensibility or whatever. And obviously decoration as well comes to the party later on. And some of us like to do very ambitious maps. Some of us like to place a million custom tiles. I'm thinking about mostly myself in DF, but Veek has been doing it. Obviously, you think about the Beaver with Boscovine. So yeah, that's one case where it's like, maybe don't worry too much about if you can instantly have a classic map, because maybe you need to shape it into something, right? Maybe you need to start with a layout and then iterate on it. And that seems to be, ringing true a lot. And so I guess you can even break it down further. And when you think about, if anybody here has watched the mapping starter guide or actually tried to make a map yourself or whatever, and you kind of know that you're placing the tiles and like, does this tile exactly blend with what I want it to blend and stuff? And I've been placing some of the coastal water tiles, the coastal like ice water, I guess, the snow water, that DF ripped out and reconstructed from the beta. And I feel like that's one of those cases where, yeah, our tile suite is actually limited. We don't have too many options. But one of the things that I repeatedly have started to do lately is, I can place those tiles and like they kind of look like they blend, and you have to really squint to figure out if they don't. You have to be very intimately familiar with the tiles and stuff. And if you're not familiar with that because you're just playing and you don't make maps often or you've never made the maps before or whatever, then yeah, you probably won't notice the difference, right? And like something maybe hopefully won't seem off to you. And that's another thing is like I remember thinking about this as I was doing some decoration on a map recently. I was doodadding and placing, all these other stuff, and I kept thinking like, doodads, if you realize that they are hand placed, they change your understanding of how much effort was put into the map. And the same is true about the custom tiles that we have. But if you just think, oh, those were automatically placed or generated or whatever, because you kind of construe them just like regular tiles, right? Like maybe the average person who just doesn't know anything about the editor doesn't realize that like doodads are even a thing, and like ramps are doodads, for example, and stuff. So like maybe some deformation in the terrain or some bush or whatever is actually a doodad, but it just looks like a subtile or something. And then you think to yourself, oh, okay, well, yeah, maybe that was edited and maybe that wasn't. It's all the stuff that you have to think about and try to break down differently in general. And like, does it really matter if somebody recognizes that you put all this effort into stuff in the context of placing tiles or hand picking a bunch of stuff? Like it will add credibility, I guess, or it will make people think, maybe slightly higher of you in that context of like, oh, interesting, you managed to do this. But you put in the time, effort, and so on. It's kind of like when I think about Metathrom's campaigns way back. This is a reach and a half, I know. But when I think about Flame Knives and Eon of the Hawk, it undoubtedly took a lot of time to, get all of the locations and triggers taken care of. And even the mod work that he did, as minimal as it seemed to be in a lot of cases. And like just to make sure that everything worked to whatever degree that it worked, which was not very well and not to a high level of quality at the end of the day, it was a big time investment, right? And so like time investment doesn't equate to product worth necessarily. Like there is a correlation, but I guess it really depends on like what ideas you're realizing using the time that you have. And so you can have a lot of time invested into something that just isn't that great of an idea to begin with. And then obviously you won't be in a good spot. And that's exactly what Metathrom had. But if you think about this in the context of placing tiles or whatever, yeah, you can place a lot of tiles. You can, it's take a lot of time to do that. And maybe you end up over decorating, over doodadding. Now it's too constrained and the paths are too awkward or whatever, right? And so you can think of it in that way. But I guess the point I was making, I was even a little bit different than that because it was something like, people aren't going to know, the vast majority of people who play your content in a StarCraft map, for example, for CMBW, are not going to recognize what's a doodad and what isn't, and what was manually placed and what wasn't. And even if they did somehow recognize that, like their general vibe of like playing through the map is not really going to be colored by that too much, I think. I think generally speaking, what you're going to see is most people just like the terrain environment that you've made or don't like it, right? And like, oh, okay, I have this ability to check it out and walk around this cool environment, and yeah, it's got some tiles I haven't seen before or whatever. Like that's probably the extent of what they're thinking about, and maybe ideally they're focused on the gameplay anyway, right? And so that they sort of bypass all of that, and then in that case, like they're mostly just thinking about the function of the terrain, and they're definitely not paying attention to any would-be terrain blocks that might be lying around in some of your environments. And so I guess what I'm trying to get at here is just that I definitely think it's been healthier for me to not worry and agonize over individual blends or whatever. Not that this is really a problem. It's not like this is a recent discovery, but I watched this video by Struthless, which is he's kind of like a quirky, I think Australian content creator and stuff. And so he's got some interesting ideas, and he has a funny way of displaying them. And maybe like the presentation style might even be a turnoff for some people. I personally was able to, go through it fine. One of the things that I took away from this video, which I'll link in the description because I actually don't remember the name of it, but it was a pretty informative video in general. It was a bunch of ideas that worked pretty well for him as far as actually finishing stuff and in general, like finding some value in the work that he was doing or whatever. And one of the things that resonated with me personally in my journey through creativity and work and stuff is that he had basically done a bunch of stuff and started a bunch of projects, but because he hadn't finished most of them, he couldn't really put anything to a portfolio. And so I think he's like a videographer and an editor and all of this like graphic design stuff. And so he does a bunch of more, I guess it's weird to call that physical work, but it's not like a video game. It's not like programming. And so anyway, he was able to, like, somebody asked him for a portfolio for a job, which you usually, I mean, you get asked about like your resume or whatever in video games, so it's not super translatable necessarily. But of course, some people will ask, have you shipped a game or whatever if you're applying for a game developer job. And anyway, the main idea that he goes by is that he couldn't really give them a portfolio of a bunch of stuff that wasn't finished. So when he thought he had like 20 things to put in his portfolio, he really only had 2. And that's a pretty big shock when you realize that, right? And then I guess the other thing was, so anyway, like he kind of goes on, and I don't necessarily want to restate the entire video's thesis, but the main thing that I took away from it was that there was some example of like he wanted to write a book, and obviously just like my map example where you're trying to agonize over all the tiles, or I guess the more abstract game example where you're trying to make sure it's perfect. The idea is just, can you make a crappy book, or can you write a crappy book? Can you produce a crappy map? Can you, crappy map, map crap? Can you do any of this stuff, right? And like, if you can, then you're probably in a pretty good spot. Like, then you can sort of iterate and fluff it up and edit it afterwards, right? And then he talks a little bit about flow state as well and how that figures into it. Anyway, it's a pretty good video. People should watch it, especially if they have this kind of struggle. And I've definitely, I feel like I'm better at dealing with all of those problems than I used to be. But it was nice and interesting, and I guess maybe cathartic in some way to see somebody put it to words and describe it in a more like definitive way, where previously, I guess, there have been some DadCaw episodes and some other content that I've produced where I talk about this, and some conversations I've had with friends and co-workers, if you want to use that term, compatriots in the space. And all of this to say, yeah, it's been kind of interesting to have a little bit of a talk with all of that, basically just going over how all that works and how all that looks. And when I come away with it, I think, okay, yeah, it's kind of interesting and useful to see somebody else put it to more of a fine point maybe, or describe it in a different way through their life experience. It was instructive, to say the least. So yeah, good video, and definitely predicated me talking about it on Pr0totype, now that I happen to just get recommended that particular video. And in general, I guess one of the main things I can say is that one of the ways that I will affirm to, like, again, I don't necessarily think about it as changing my behavior because I feel like I was already on that path, or, doing these things. But it's a reminder, I suppose, to, not worry too much about making sure everything is perfect, and just in general, like, build something that you can iterate upon, and worry about the quality, like trust the process. That was another thing that was in the video. Like, worry about the, getting to the promised land. And I think you've seen this in action with a lot of the CMBW changes. We've overhauled reclamation, and it's very different and probably too powerful, but we'll trust the process. We'll get it wrangled. We'll get it working. We'll make it so that it is a value add to the project, and, isn't basically, surplus to requirements as well, where it's just kind of too useless or whatever, right? Like, people have this idea that maybe revival from corpses is either useless or OP or whatever. Like, that was something that Meskit said in the server, and it's definitely a difficult thing to balance, which is the main point I think he's illustrating. But I think we can take care of it. We've dealt with stuff like the Star Sovereign before. We've dealt with all sorts of stuff, even the Ion Cannon. We know what to do about it, and so I'm not too worried about it. It'll get taken care of over time. And that is the first of our 3 topics that I wanted to discuss. They all have some sort of, interplay and connectivity between each other, simpatico, you could say. The second topic I want to talk about is single player and co-op content. I called this kind of like more of the casual content. Obviously, we've been focusing very heavily on player versus player stuff, 1v1s especially, because, our player count still isn't super high. So we're not regularly seeing 2v2s and team games in general, outside of maybe some sort of fraudarchy and occasional games every now and then. So yeah, it's not super common compared to 1v1s, and that's actually why you haven't seen too many 2v2 castovers. I guess the other thing I can point out too is that FFAs obviously seem to desync quite a bit, and so we're trying to figure that out as a troubleshoot, but at the same time, until that's back, we won't really necessarily see those either, at least not super often, right? Now, maybe with like smaller numbers of players or whatever, it might be possible. It could also be possible that the desyncs are due to people not updating correctly despite our investment into the launcher. But I kind of doubt that last one. I feel like it's been happening a little bit too frequently for us to, get owned by that. But we did re-enable some of the more aggressive desync checks. So I guess we should at least not silently happen anymore. And so maybe that'll help us knock exactly what's up, and track it down in that sense. And we'll have to see where we can go from there, right? Now, beyond all of that, the main reason I'm bringing up the single player and more casual side in general is actually because I believe you would pronounce his username as Rainiril or Rainiril, something like that. Anyway, he's on the server, and apparently he's been playing CMBW versus AI for the most part with his friends and with his brother and stuff. And he's been making his own maps and whatnot. And that's all neat. That's cool. That's like the bespoke, like super specific. Hey, I got like this very small community that I'm working with. Or I mean, I don't know how small. I don't know how many friends the guy has. Maybe he's got 100 friends, bro. You never know. But anyway, like the idea is that, just this one guy is working on, making his own stuff and using CMBW as the basis. And then they can use that to have a good experience. And I've obviously not really been updating the AI quite a bit at all recently. And so that is actually something that changed today. I should mention that I'm recording this on the 16th of March, 2023. And in this episode, or before this episode started recording, I was working on making it so that the AI would build less production structures per base. And some of the Protoss ones were absolutely crazy. Like they could get up to 20 grand libraries or something, which obviously they would never really be able to fit in most bases. So yeah, I've made the numbers a lot lower, and I hope that this will make it so that they, for one, don't block themselves in their base as often. There's been some adjustments to colonies to hopefully reduce that happening for Zerg as well. Not just in terms of the max count for like the Larvosk, which obviously has gone down, but also in terms of their building placement in the first place. But the other thing that they would do in addition to blocking themselves in is they would have too many production structures. And I mean, that would maybe stop them from gaining tempo because maybe they would have all this money and they would spend it on production instead of units or expansions or whatever. The other thing, of course, the other component to that is if they have too many production structures and their economy can't sustain all of them and they keep building more production structures because they're dumb and the request system is not super easy to, intertwine with, we'll say, then yeah, that will be in a situation where like, I can't really check their income level, estimate based on that, how many production structures they can actually support, and then like cater the production count to that, right? There's no way for me to do that. So I just kind of hope that by adding more production structures, the later the game goes, they'll also have more bases, which is not necessarily like always going to happen. But I feel like in general with this lower count, it will probably help. I can't be super, confident in that necessarily, but I do feel like it will help in general, and we'll just have to wait and see. But that's only one update. There's going to be a lot of other things where I try to smooth out the build orders a little bit, make them a little bit less death, like a little bit more rush prone, I suppose. Like if you just rush them down in the early stages of the game, you can often kill them before like 5 minutes. And some players, recognize this and just don't rush them as a result because they want to actually play a game. But if it does happen at all, it is kind of lame. And so I would like it to be something more skill based, I guess. Like if you rush the AI in order to defeat them, you actually need to display some more skill than maybe what people have been able to get away with thus far. Like Mirian, actually, in the server, he's been playing some CMBW recently. Shout out to him. Obviously, a member of the Chad Coffee crew with all of the stuff he's been sending us in increments of 3. But one of the things that he mentioned is that he apparently killed a Zerg player, I think it was, or just an AI in general, with 7 Masons. He rushed them down with 7 Masons. I don't know if that's actually like... I would need to see the replay for that or something, probably. I would need to see that reproduced to see exactly how they broke, because it might just be that they don't respond to worker rushes specifically that much or that well. But I kind of feel like maybe that's a map specific issue, if anything. Like maybe he played it on I'm blanking on the name, Megalith Empire, where it's like kind of small rush distance or whatever. I don't know. Like maybe he played something like that and then he was like, yeah, bro, check me out. I'm fucking epic. I would like for that stuff to not necessarily be possible, right? Because I kind of feel like worker rushes, if they were meta, it would be pretty stupid, right? I also just don't understand how the AI could possibly lose to that. So it sounds like something really stupid happened. And that's an extreme case, of course. But we have to remember that like these are things that I would prefer players to not be able to do. Like, I don't want them to have to... the more common case is just you choose not to do any early aggression. I would prefer players not have to make that choice if they want to actually play a game versus the AI. I think that's probably the biggest thing. I don't know if I'll ever be able to make it so that they're particularly good in 1v1s. They're definitely a lot more threatening in 2v2s and anything beyond that, maybe even FFAs, I would say. So there's some stuff to think about there. But for the most part, yeah, I'm pretty convinced that it is soon going to be time to attempt some more content in general that's based around the idea of the single player stuff, and more attention paid to the AI and try to improve them up a little bit. Because obviously we've been focusing a lot on the player versus player stuff, and that doesn't mean that our focus will necessarily change too much from that, but I wouldn't mind dedicating a couple of hours out of every week or whatever just to work on the AI specifically. And I think it would also be interesting too, is something that I've been thinking about that doesn't really fit into any of the three categories that I already had outlined, but I think that, something I was actually listening to Veek's mapping stream, because he did a CMBW map on stream he was working on. And I think it's called like Wild Whirlwind or something. That was one of the names that was floated anyway. I'll have to go and check that out after. It's a very small map, but one of the things that he was saying is that like maybe the distance between mains could be potentially too big on some of his other maps. And I almost wonder if it's not the case that it's the opposite, because I was looking at some of the ladder maps that are in Remastered, and it does seem like the main distances can be quite large on most of those maps, especially by ground path, but just in general. I feel like maybe we're missing something from that. Like maybe we should try to take a page out of that book, at least in terms of the distances. Like, I don't know how many of the other design edicts from the remastered maps are worth taking a look at, or Brood War ladder maps in general, right? Because there's so much that's different between the two games. But I do feel like, Meska has pointed out that maybe a lot of the maps feel very open, but also, the rush distances are kind of small in a lot of the maps you think about. Terminus, obviously Megalith Empire is a particular example where that was like a deliberate thing I was trying to do. You think about even, I keep saying this as well, if Excelsior was remade and the map was like 1.25x bigger or something, like that would actually be perfect for spacing, but obviously you can't really do that. So that's kind of lame. What else was there? There's obviously, I don't know, I just think about like a lot of the maps in general. Sunstarved as well was an example of this. Obviously now it's in the non-standard folder, which is where I put any map that I feel like, well, it's non-standard, but especially if it's my map in there, it's because I'm like done supporting it as well. It almost kind of doubles as an outdated folder or whatever. But if it's not my map, then I don't know if people have decided it's outdated or if they've just retired it. I guess maybe we could have a separate folder for that or whatever, but I'm not too concerned about it necessarily. But yeah, so all of these things are about the maps, and that doesn't really fit into any of the other categories. But I do feel like we could probably try for taking some of the cues from those maps, making it so that the mains have a little bit more distance associated with them, and seeing how that shapes up. So yeah, I expect some more experiments in that vein as time goes on. And maybe that will also naturally help the AI, because they tend to go for Expo first. I think if you can successfully do Expo first in some matchups, then that's a better, healthier version of the game in general, like even in 1v1s and stuff, because I'm generally kind of averse to the idea that you can never do some sort of macro play. Like, it kind of feels like, especially if you're Terran versus an aggressive opponent, you kind of have to be super defensive anyway, and that does feel a little lame anyway. So just some food for thought, I suppose. Maybe we continue to think about other balance changes that we might do to adjust how all of that stuff works out. Like, I could maybe see delaying or increasing the time cost of some things, specifically like maybe the early air units you have at your disposal could be increased in terms of the time cost, right? So that you have to, like, they hit later, basically, the first ones. But at the same time, that obviously blanket nerfs them in general throughout the entire game. So I don't really know how I feel about that, but that would just be one idea. So yeah, we're still considering stuff anyway. So there's your brief intermission about, some of the other things that I wanted to say. But if we go back briefly to the discussion of like single player and co-op stuff and the RTS stuff, or the casual stuff in general, I guess is how I've been displaying it compared to the player versus player and whatnot, and the 1v1 focus, I guess. Obviously, we've been talking a little bit recently about maybe trying for a tournament. We have got some issues to shore up before then. However, this was where I bring myself over to discuss Acropolis. So the Acropolis game mode was conceptualized back in the Hydra days as this thing where you were basically in a spot like in between two greater warring nations who were more interested in attacking each other than you. But because you were caught in the middle of where they were, like you could imagine you're expressly in the middle of the map, and maybe they're on like the, top left and bottom right or something. And you've got to find a way to hold on from the attacks that come your way. And then, I don't know, maybe try to relocate, or maybe try to, in general, see what you can accomplish by like focusing down one of them while you defend the other or whatever. And it was going to be this co-op thing where, say it's, a team of 2 for all sides, right? So it's a 2v2v2. You guys are smack in the middle with some good terrain advantage, but obviously bad positional disadvantage in general because you're in between 2 other teams. And like maybe only one of each team would be actually directly parallel to you or whatever. And so you can imagine one player's in the top left, one player's in the bottom right, and that's one player of each hostile force. And then the other players are like sort of, more closer to each other. And as a result, you would only really be in the firing line of one pair of the players, right? And then you wouldn't have to worry too much about the others. So anyway, I don't know how much sense that makes when I explain it like that, but that was one of the ideas that I had for trying to make it so that it's a little bit more interesting, a little bit more action. You could even maybe just put yourself in the middle of technically all 4 players, but like have them be able to attack each other. You can kind of think about like Mouth of Bethala. If the map was bigger and the inner players were on the same team, then you would imagine, okay, that's sort of what I'm talking about, right? In terms of like a map layout. And so, yeah, this mode was also going to have a bunch of other stuff in it. Like you were going to be able to secure these neutral structures that trained units for you, like automatically or whatever, at no cost, I should add. And I mean, I don't know. That sounds like a lot of feature creep, but there were some other things that were going to be unique to how Acropolis worked in general, and I was interested in seeing where that went. But now I think I can take the core identity of it, which is this co-op experience where you're outnumbered and surrounded, and like how long can you hold out for? And obviously your goal would be to win, but I don't know how believable it would be. And I guess the FFA nature of the mode would potentially help you out with that because you would take a lot of early disadvantages in the tempo department. But if you were able to secure bases or just wait long enough for the enemies to fight each other more than you, then that would also be a valid position, right? And so anyway, these are all thoughts I have. I don't know how well it would work out, but the idea that I'm floating here when I bring back Acropolis as an idea, like I just start thinking about it, is it would be really nice if we had some more co-op versus AI content in general. Like that could be a nice way to cool off after some heated PvP matches every so often. People get tilted or whatever. All right, well, you can say GG and then you can offer to play Acropolis or whatever this ends up being, right? And so that's just some of the ideas that I've had. The other thing that I was thinking about specifically for this revival of the game mode, if you will, is what if you had the ability to define like factions basically internally? And you can imagine these factions would be like Order of the Sacred Templars, stuff from the setting rewrite. All of the different, like the Imperium forces and stuff, and like all the different things that you could think about as far as various campaign-related content almost. So anything in the Chrysilian section would be, up for grabs, I guess. You think about the Nidus Trinity showing up or whatever. And so you would define factions as those, and then you would define players or commanders or whatever, and you would want to spawn a member of one of those teams. And so you would think about like spawning a team in, and you would say, give me the divine primacy. Give me 2 random members of that. And then, being able to do that would give you like transmissions. If we could program those in to be per player and stuff, you could get, obviously things like AI personalities and behaviors and whatnot. And I feel like that would be pretty interesting if you could imagine like going up in a situation where your faction is randomized, your enemy's factions are randomized, but obviously, like when their factions are automatically rolled, it determines like what they have. And so, anyway, there's like the Orion Imperium, and for the like vast majority of times they would just be Terran, but maybe they would have like some sort of abducted Zerg or something. You know what I mean? And obviously, that would make more sense for like the Nidus Trinity anyway. It would be more common anyhow. So I do think that's kind of interesting. Like maybe you would even be able to filter, like give me a Terran member of the Nidus Trinity specifically. I don't know, like, match a certain race or whatever. It feels like there would be a lot of potential for people to quickly generate, functional missions that involve these factions if we were able to hook up things like transmissions associated with those particular things specifically. Like imagine, if you will, that you're going in and trying your best to make this like campaign mission or whatever. Like what are some of the dialogue events that you actually have? A lot of them would be map non-specific, agnostic, I guess you could say. And you could imagine it would be stuff like losing an expansion, or like being under attack if you're got a human ally and you need to send him a transmission, or, massing up for an attack. I don't know, like actually defeating a player. There would be some gloating involved. And, as a result of that, you could kind of imagine this as, as I was breaking all of that down anyway, it almost made me think of the co-op mode in SC2. Obviously, that's more of like a sleep aid than an actual game, but I guess you could kind of draw some parallel there. I know in StarCraft 2, there was a period of time, and I assume this is still a feature, where if you played with AI on your team, they would actually say stuff like Raynor would be one of the people that might be the commander of your ally, and he would tell you, like, I'm taking an expansion or whatever. And, the little shit like that, that's stuff that obviously I did for a long time ago. I did it in Nemesis Stormborn. And just in general, it's stuff that I've wanted to do for, like, we're sending an attack, we're thinking of taking this base, we've just lost a base, we're under attack, whatever. And, even in my, like, the Toddborn maps for my brother's birthday, like, we're talking like 2019, I think. Like, even then, it was a lot of stuff that's like, hey, check me out. I've got all this, junk, all these transmissions where, like, Mongo, has some witty line for when he's under attack and you're his ally or whatever, versus he has a witty line for when he's attacking you as an enemy and stuff. So anyway, like, you almost had these generic, if you want to call them that, transmissions that applied to pretty much any context. And you imagine if you have like 20 variations of each event, it probably doesn't get too old too quickly, especially if you have, like, I don't know, 20 commander options or something crazy, right? Like if you have a bunch of options for each one or something. Now, it would get a little bit tricky in the early stages if we were to implement a system like this, because if we only had like 2 commanders per faction, then there would have to be repeats, I guess. And I don't know how we would control that exactly. Like if the commanders rolled as the same, like say you spawn 4 of, the Nidus Trinity, but we only have set up 2, like, oh, well, I guess the second instance of each commander that was already there would just be the same commander, and then you wouldn't, I don't know how you would do some safety for that, basically. So yeah, there would be weird shit like that where we would have to figure it out. But as we fill in all of the different characters, and basically we have like unit responses, but for characters like commanders or whatever, that could be really interesting for defining, some of these transmissions and stuff. And I guess maybe if you set the commander of a human player, then the transmissions would also exist there, and you would just be that commander, right? So that could kind of be interesting too, I guess. Anyhow, all of this is just to say that I've been thinking about some compelling RTS co-op content and single-player content as well, and just improvements to what CMBW can offer in these departments. So if you guys have thoughts for that yourself, definitely leave them in the comments below, because I am interested and I am looking for those. And I do think it's an important thing to take a step forward. We go back to the first topic of this episode was all about things that came to me as ideas after watching that Struthless video, and how, yeah, it's probably better to just have something that's actually finished. And, in terms of being playable or functional or whatever, you can iterate on it until you feel like it is finished. But, if you have something that's actually playable or actually, whatever, functional, then that's going to go a long way towards allaying any concerns about grinding out the extra time. And beyond that, it's like, yeah, I don't know, if we just had more content, if we had more different variety of things, like maybe it's high time we actually do focus a little bit on the campaign. We're working on our own game, so I don't really know what makes sense and what doesn't as far as time commitments go, because in theory, when we finish our game, it'll be done and we'll be ready to just make the next game or more content in the first game or whatever. And as a result of that, you wouldn't necessarily think we would be busy making content in CMBW, especially since it would be like the editor experience in particular would be grossly inferior. And in theory, the game itself would be grossly inferior compared to our future title. So when we think about stuff like that, I really don't know if it makes sense for that. Like, is there really much value add once we have our own game? But anyway, maybe there's some like lower efforts, like again, just make something that's functional and maybe worry less about it being perfect and presentable and all this other stuff. Perfectly presentable, I should say. just make it. And then, you kind of finish it and you say you finished it and it's out. Maybe that's the better move. I don't know. So anyway, as always, interested in hearing your guys' thoughts. As always, you guys can chuck us some threes. And as always, there will be more episodes of Prototype coming and more content on the way in general. We're hoping to get some more 2v2s out so we can get some 2v2 castovers. If you would like to contribute to that, then join the Discord server if you're not there already. Grab the mod if you don't have it already. Don't try to install it in remastered, as that one Argentinian guy found out earlier. And generally speaking, be a lovely and contributing member of the No Frauds Club. And you too can get featured in my casts when I'm angrily yelling about how people aren't splitting their workers and stuff. So yeah, look forward to that. And until next time.